Here we want to talk about conservation and biodiversity. First, we will take a look at what biodiversity is. Biodiversity, we're looking at a variety of different types of diversity. We've already talked a little bit about species diversity, and remember, species diversity can look at species richness, which is just the total number of species in an area. So we just count how many different species are there. But we also can look at the relative abundance of each of those species. Do we have one dominant species and a whole bunch of rare species, or are they more or less evenly distributed, so we have about the same number of each type? And those would give us two slightly different measures of species diversity. So we could just count them, or we could take into account their abundance. We focused a little bit on species diversity, but we need to remember that when we're trying to conserve biodiversity, we're looking at all of the diversity of life, not just individual species. What about the health of ecosystems? What about the health of the genetic makeup of those species? So if we save a species, but we only have one individual of that species left, then we clearly don't have the genetic diversity within that population that we used to have. So we can look at various other things. So one of the things we often will look at is this idea of genetic diversity. Okay, so I have a population of a particular species, but how diverse is it? Let's say we compare a population before and after a decline. So the species has undergone a major decline. Prior to that decline, we may have had 48 different genes for eye color. And now after the decline, maybe we only have 2 different genes for eye color. So we've lost some of the diversity that was originally in that population. Remember that in order for a population to evolve to changing conditions, they have to have that genetic diversity, because natural selection doesn't work without that genetic diversity. So if we take our populations and we get rid of all that diversity, then we're essentially making it so those populations are going to have a really hard time adapting to changes in their environment, which of course we are also exacerbating. In addition to genetic, we can also look at chemical diversity. And that kind of goes hand in hand, right? Because the chemicals that are made inside the body are a result of the genes that are there. Some plants have genes for producing certain compounds that protect them from being eaten by herbivores. But if we lose some of those genes, those compounds could also be lost. So we want to make sure that we keep all of that diversity in that population. Now, another thing that's not showing on this diagram is population diversity. What if we have a particular species, but those species are separated on, say, 4 different islands, and individuals don't travel back and forth? So these are 4 different distinct populations. Something happens on 3 of them, so we're left with 1 population. So we've protected the species, but we still now only have 1 population, so we don't have the diversity we had before, where we have these 4 different populations. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. Just saving one little remote population isn't the same thing as saving what was originally there. And then we can also look at ecosystem diversity. All of these will tie together. So we want to make sure that all of these different ecosystems that we have and the little micro ecosystems that are part of those, that we preserve those as well. And that will, of course, then also help to preserve the species that are inside of those ecosystems. What does the current species diversity look like? So here we see a table of estimated and predicted numbers of species. Remember, we haven't seen everything. We know that we've described a certain number of species, but we know there's more out there that we haven't seen. So there's about 1.5 million species of eukaryotes that have been named, but that probably accounts for less than 20% that are there. That means that there's probably about 8.7 million species present. If we've only accounted for about 20% of the species, how many species are we losing that we never knew that we had because they've never been named or described? Now we'll take a quick look at patterns of species diversity. We've looked at this a little bit already. One thing we want to think about is the concept of an endemic species. An endemic species is one that exists in this particular location and it doesn't exist elsewhere. It's unique to that particular area. And of course, endemic species are tricky because they are not widely spread. That means that they are at more risk of extinction, because if their one little location is destroyed, that species is destroyed with it. Now, another concept we've talked a little bit about is biogeography. This just looks at the way that living organisms are distributed across Earth. And one of the big patterns we saw was latitudinal gradients in species diversity. Remember what this meant is that we had the most species around the equator, and then as we move away in latitude, either going north or south in latitude, that number of species declines. So there's this gradient. And that's one of the reasons why we sometimes focus so heavily on things like tropical deforestation and the loss of habitat in those tropical regions, because that's where most of the species are. If we lose 1 acre of tropical rainforest, we're going to lose a lot more species than if we lose 1 acre of temperate forest. Why do we see this pattern? Why are there more species around the equator and fewer as we go away from the equator? One of the ideas is just the age of the ecosystems. The idea that those ecosystems have been in that location for a longer period of time than the ecosystems at higher and lower latitudes. If you think about the way that the Earth changed over time and the land masses changed, the other areas have moved away from that original location much more than the equator has. So they've been in that location longer. So they've had longer to evolve. The different ideas about why we might have more species in the tropics are not exclusive of one another. So we could have this one working, but we could also have energy and productivity affecting it. So it could be age, and it could also be that the productivity in those areas is much higher. Think of the solar radiation, and the amount of photosynthesis that happens in those areas is much higher than it is as we go away. So if we think of food chains and the energy within an ecosystem, there's more energy in those areas. And it's year-round. We have that productivity, and it's very consistent throughout the year. We don't have climatic events that really decrease productivity at certain times of year. Along with that also is there's a lot more habitat heterogeneity in that area. Those habitats are more varied. If we were to look at, say, a grassland doesn't have a lot of heterogeneity. But if you go and look inside of a tropical forest, there's a lot of heterogeneity there. And that then opens niches for new species, right? So if we have a more heterogeneous environment, more speciation, more species there. And we also have more stability. These ecosystems that are in this area, because of the productivity, they're very stable environments. And they have very complex and stable food webs. That stability then also perpetuates more speciation. These are just a few of the hypotheses as to why we might see more species at the equator. And it also lets us know why we need to protect that area because of that high species diversity.